Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at decimal operations. We're going to start off with adding and subtracting. The rules for adding and subtracting are fairly easy. We're going to first line up our decimals. Remember we talked about in class, out of sight to the right. What that means is if you have a whole number, you're not going to see your decimal, but your decimal is always there. If it's out of sight, it's always to the right. Let's take a look at an example. Here is our addition example. We have 5 and 6/10. We're going to go ahead and write these numbers vertically just like we did in elementary school when we were adding. Then we've got the whole number 4. And the whole number 4 doesn't show a decimal. So our decimal is out of sight, which means it is to the right. And then we have 34 hundredths. Lining up those decimals, and I went ahead and filled in zeros there. Remember, we can add zeros. It doesn't change the value behind the decimal. And we have 004, adding just like normal. 6 plus 3 gives me 9. Bringing down my decimal, and 5 plus 4 gives me 9. Once we line up our decimal, we make sure that our decimal is in line in my answer. Now when I move to subtraction, I have 8 minus 1 and 2 23 hundredths. So we have 8, and the 8 whole number doesn't show a decimal, but it's out of sight, so it is to the right. And 1 and 23 hundredths. Now with subtraction, we're just going to subtract like normal. We're going to go and regroup. And subtract like normal. 9 minus 2 gives me 7. Bring down my decimal, and 7 minus 1 is 6. So with adding and subtracting, we must line up our decimals. Line them up. Line those decimals up. Now we're going to move on to multiplication. With multiplication, we're going to multiply as normal as if there were no decimals. Multiply like normal. Then we're going to count how many numbers are behind the decimal in the problem. And we're going to move our decimal in your answer so that there are the same amount of numbers behind the decimal. Let's take a look at what this looks like. We've got our multiplication problem, 16 times 18 hundredths. Now, when we multiply, it doesn't matter what order that we multiply in because multiplication is commutative. So I could put the 18 hundredths or the 16 on top. It doesn't really matter. Typically, we like to put our longer number on the top. This one both has 2 digits, so it doesn't really matter. 8 times 6 is 48. I'm going to multiply. 8 times 1 is 8. Plus 4 gives me 12. Put my 0 placeholder. And 1 times 6 is 6. And 1 times 1 is 1. Now, all I'm doing is adding my partial products as just like normal. I haven't done a single thing with our decimal. Now it's time to take a look at our decimal. So we multiplied like normal, just like step 1 said. Now we're going to count up how many numbers are behind the decimal. In our first number, there were no numbers behind the decimal. So in our second factor, there were 2 numbers behind the decimal, the 8 and the 1. So in my answer, I have to move my decimal 2 places so that there are 2 numbers behind the decimal. So I have 2 and 88 hundredths. One thing that's very, very important and that I see students all the time trying to do is they try and take that rule of line them up from addition and subtraction, and they try to line up your decimals in multiplication. Do not do that, guys. What's going to happen is you are going to end up having to multiply by zeros that you shouldn't have to do. And a lot of times my students get their numbers all out of line whenever they're adding because they're multiplying so many rows of zeros. Don't do that. If your decimal naturally falls into place, if this had been 16 hundredths times 18 hundredths, then my decimals would have naturally lined up, and that's okay. But don't go out of your way and add decimals and zeros to make them line up. They do not have to line up in multiplication. All right, now let's take a look at division. My division rules. We're going to start off by writing our division problem in standard form. Then we're going to move the divisor's decimal to make it a whole number. We don't want a decimal on the outside. Then when you move it, count how many times you moved the decimal. Then move the dividend's decimal the same number of places as the divisor. So however many times you moved it on the outside, move it on the inside. And bring your decimal up to the quotient. And then you're going to divide like normal. So let's take a look at an example. 40 divided by 5/100. I have the number 40, and I'm going to divide it by 5/100. Now, I don't want that decimal on the outside, so I'm going to move the decimal to make it a whole number. Now, I just moved my decimal 2 places. So on the inside, I have to move my decimal 2 places. Notice I had to add a decimal, but that's okay. We can always add our decimal. 40 is a whole number out of sight to the right, so here's my decimal. I moved it 2 places, so that means I have to move it 2 places here. That leaves me with these 2 empty spots, which we've talked about so many times. A lot of times when we were comparing and ordering, when we were converting fractions, when we were converting decimals to percents, we had this issue a lot. And when we have these empty jumps, we end up putting zeros in those positions. Now, my decimal is now over here. It is no longer in between this 0 and this 0. It's over here at the end. Now, I'm going to move that decimal up into my quotient, and I'm going to divide like normal. I no longer have 5/100ths. I now have just the whole number 5. Now, 5 does not go into 4, but 5 does go into 40 8 times. So I'm going to subtract, bring down the decimal. Even though I had a 0 remainder, I still had place values that needed to be divided. So 5 into 0 is 0. 0 times 5 gives me 0. And now 5 into 0 again is 0. I no longer have any lines up in my quotient that I need to divide. So 800 is my final answer. Last minute, a couple of things to remember. My students have a hard time with division and multiplication, especially in word problems, making sure that they can determine which operation it's asking for. Here's a couple little helpful reminders. If there is something that is being repeated, then you're going to be multiplying. When you divide, be careful to put what's being divided as the dividend, the number inside the house. I always see students who give me crazy answers that aren't really realistic because they're dividing the wrong number. So please be careful of those 2 things. Hope this video of operations with decimals has helped you.